Before we start this video, a large thank you to Almacus and Machi for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And as always, an immense thank you to Halo Burner for the continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoy the video. Before we start this video is sponsored by us. We just released a new animation set on our asset store page, the Unarmed set. If you want to check that out, there will be a link in the description. It does help support the channel and the series. Hello everybody, today we're going to handle teleporting via the Sites of Grace. So let's go to our player UI manager here now, and let's add a new window for the Sites of Grace manager. So I'm going to right click over here, create a new empty game object. Going to call this Sites or Sites of Grace Manager. I'm going to call it Site of Grace Manager. Hold Alt, click here, expand it to the size of the UI. I'm going to yoink one of the menus here just for the background, really. I'm not actually yoinking it for the content. I just want that background because it's nice to keep the UI somewhat uniform. And this background is the exact same background as the other backgrounds, so it is nice to do that. When I have that wherever I need it, I'm just going to rename this to Site of Grace or whatever. Whoop, not going to unparent that because that messes with the size. So I'm going to call this Site of Grace window. Now, this is where we're going to choose between doing a bunch of stuff, but for now there's only one button here, one option. I believe in ELDEN there's storage, there's teleport. You can do a couple other things there too. I know you can, and I'm forgetting. Right, like upgrading your flasks and such. But for now, we just have the teleport. So I'm going to call this travel. And I'm going to spend very little time here making the button look somewhat presentable. But this is Programmer UI, and this is not a UI tutorial. This is a tutorial on the functionality and the game design mechanics of Elden Ring. So I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to stretch it out so it looks like it's kind of fitting in the UI all right. And I'm going to add a vertical layout group here just to make it a little bit more organized. And I'm going to add a title to this too. Also, I've said this a couple times before, but if you guys want to see an episode on how I design UI, I am by no means a pro, but I have lots of hours of practice, and I quite like the UI Nephilim. I could go over my workflow sometime. All right, there is the button. Let's add a new UI Text Mesh Pro. This is going to be the title. I'm going to call it Sites of Grace title or Site of Grace title. Again, just to show what menu you are in. So this will be Site of Grace, and I'm going to expand that so it's not kind of falling over itself. I'm going to center it and keep the color too. The color's fine. We got a black background, so it just stands out the most. I'm going to not force expand by height and width. I'm going to instead do it manually by setting the spacing like 50. That's fine. And that looks good. All right, cool. So now let's go to our UI again and create a new empty game object. I'm going to call this Teleport Location Manager. I just like having these as two separate managers because they are two entirely separate windows. One window gets you to a bunch of managers, but those individual managers have their own stuff going on. So that's why I give it its own script. It's just neater that way and easier to keep track of. Again, going to copy the background. I'm going to do the whole thing I did before, make the window the same size just because it's nice to have it consistent. I am going to change this name to Location Window, and I'm going to change the title from Sites of Grace title to World Locations. And you may want to have like several quote-unquote pages of these where you can flick through them with right bumper and left bumper. But to keep it simple, we're just going to do one for now because the logic is the same other than just, opening and closing different game objects. Something very easy for all of you to figure out, especially if you're at this part in the series. So we have location 0 and location 1. We'll just do two of these for now just to show you how this works. I'll call the first one the start room, and I'll call the second one beyond the boss. And as the name suggests, I'll put the Site of Grace just beyond the boss room. All right, let's close that menu. So let's next go over to the Site of Grace Manager game object and add a script. I'm going to call this Player UI Site of Grace Manager, just to keep in our name organization here. Player UI in front of it, and then the name of the UI script, Site of Grace Manager. Naming conventions, that was what I was looking for. Let's erase the start and update functionality and drop in our namespace as is per tradition. Let's copy this menu game object from another Player UI Manager and yoink it. And let's copy the open and close menu logic because guess what? It's going to be identical through all of these. Maybe all of them, I assume. So far, all of them. So we're going to want to basically say that we do have a menu window open. And then we want to activate this specific menu window. This is so if we want to close all menu windows at once. We have an easy functionality here to close them. And also we need to notify the Player UI Manager that something is open because that limits some of our inputs in case some of you forgot. So we have open Site of Grace Manager window, and we have close. Close could be used to get out of the menu when you're in it, or it could be used from closing all menus from the player UI manager. So let's go add it there too. Let's make a variable here for hide the inspector so we can't see it. Public player UI site of grace manager. I'm going to call it player UI site of grace manager. Just like the rest is equal to get component in children because the game object is a child of this object. Player UI site of grace manager is equal to get component in children. Player UI site of grace manager. Just like that. Close all menus. Same thing. We're going to reference it here. Player UI site of grace manager. And I believe it just calls it close site of grace manager menu. Yes. Save. Looks good. All right, back over to the player UI site of grace manager. It's going to minimize all this here now. And I'm going to make a new function, public void, open teleport location menu. So we don't have that menu script established yet, so let's just leave that blank. But we can still drag in the logic on the button. So go down to the button. Let's make an on-click event. And we can say teleport. I'm going to change the name of the button to teleport to new location. And then we expand the on-click event, add one here. And we're going to drag in the site of grace manager because that's where the script is. We're going to select the function from that script, and we're going to select open teleport location menu, just like that. Now I'm going to create a new script on the teleport location manager. I'm going to call it player UI teleport location manager. And we can create an add, keeping with our naming conventions. I'm going to erase start and update functionality, add in our namespace. And I'm going to yoink the open, close, and the menu game object variables and functions. Because, again, it's going to work the exact same way. There we go. And I'm going to change it from open site of grace manager menu to open teleport location manager menu. Looks good. Do the same thing down here now for a close. Looks good. Now let's go over to the player UI manager. And again, create a variable for this. Let's hide it in the inspector because we don't need to see it. Public player UI teleport location manager. Do the same thing, call it on awake. And in case you're wondering why we have these as public, because in case some of you forgot, this does act as the main player UI hub where other scripts can reference other scripts from this one central location. Okay, looks good. Now over on close all menu windows, let's do the same thing here by saying player UI teleport location manager close teleport location manager menu. Looks good. Now drag in our menu variables just so we don't forget. And now let's go over to the teleport to new location game object, and let's add select button on enable. That script we made a while ago. So when we open it up, it automatically selects that button. And let's do it to the first location too, even though we're gonna remove that almost certainly, but let's just make sure it's working first. Now over on open teleport location menu, let's say player UI.instance.player UI teleport location manager.open teleport location manager menu. And this is on the site of grace manager. We're gonna first close the site of grace manager by calling that function above it. Now let's go over to the site of grace interactable. Let's make a function on this for actually teleporting the player. So I'm just going to scroll down here. Let's actually open the menu first. Forgot about that bit. It's pretty important. So we have rest at site of grace. You can see we got some temporary code, and also under reset all characters. In the future, I'm going to show you guys how to do this. I'll make a to-do note right here so don't forget. If you got more than like 25 characters, you should not be spawning these and deleting them because you might get like a stutter for a second. You can't do it. It's not a big deal, but you really shouldn't. What you should do instead is reset all their stats, their animations, and positions. That way you're not recreating the game object and it's not fetching all those get components on awake and causing a bit of a stutter. So if you have a lot of enemies, you want to just reposition them and kind of reset their stats. It will cost you almost nothing. So I will do that in a future episode, but for now the project is still very small. That's very fine. I'll leave it as it is. And for the intuitives who want to try it on their own, I'm sure you can do it. Very straightforward. So player UI instance, player UI site of grace manager, open site of grace manager. So now we interact with it. If we already have it enabled, you can see, boom, site of grace. There we go. If we travel, I go to the travel menu. But these buttons do nothing currently, so let's make them do something. So let's go to the world first. I'm going to duplicate this room. I'm just going to quickly snap back. Okay, there we go. So I got another room. I'll duplicate this site of grace now. I'll bring it over here. I'm just realizing I did not save this site of grace as a prefab. So I'm going to do that real fast. I'm going to delete this one. Go to my prefabs folder, and I'm going to drag in my original site of grace and save it as a prefab. Let's duplicate it now. And I'm just going to, not that it makes a difference, but I'm just going to turn around and make it face the other one. And I'm going to open my prefab now, and we're going to add a transform here so the player can teleport to it. And this is a model we yoinked off of somewhere. Some nice gentleman made it. But unfortunately, it's got this ugly random geo here with really funny names. So I'm going to unpack the prefab and drag it all under a game object named model, because I don't like seeing cylinder sphere, box 04567. There we go, that's fine. Now I'm going to create a new empty game object. This will act as a transform. This is where the player is going to teleport when we use the Site of Grace. So I'm just going to position that right here outside of it. That looks fine. And I'm going to open up the Site of Grace again. I'm going to make a variable for this so we can store it here. And of course you can edit this location on any Site of Grace, but you shouldn't need to most of the time. So we can say teleport transform serializable field transform. We can call this teleport transform. Okay, let's save that, and now we go back into the prefab. It's going to reload. We drag it in that teleport transform variable, and that looks good. I'm just going to call this teleport transform to match the variable name. And then we can save this prefab like so. Looks good. Now, let's go to our world object manager. Let's go over here now and make a list of sites of grace. So, header, sites of grace. Looks good. Now, public list, sites of grace. Just like we did with the fog walls, and we can make a add and remove function just by copying the fog walls logic. It's identical except for the variable type. The variable type will not be fog wall interactable. It will be Site of Grace interactable, and of course the name won't be fog wall. It will be Site of Grace, and of course we're not referencing the fog walls. We're going to reference the sites of grace. I think I called that Site of Grace for that lists. Yes, let's rename that to sites of grace, plural. There we go. And just as I said before, reference the sites of grace lists, add it, and the fog wall interactable variable becomes a Site of Grace interactable variable, and the name fog wall becomes Site of Grace. Cool, looks good. Now we're probably never going to use the remove function, but just in case it's here, I'll make it. I can't think of a case where you'd remove a Site of Grace from a list, because if you don't have them unlocked, we're just going to simply hide them from the teleport location, but they still exist in game. But just in case, let's just add it here anyway. Okay. Cool. Save. Now, go to the Site of Grace interactable. Come right down here at the very bottom, or where we have a space, and we're going to make a function. But first, sorry, on network spawn, we have to add this to our list. So on network spawn, world object manager.instance.add Site of Grace to list. Pass this, as in this Site of Grace script. Cool. Now, over on the player UI teleport location manager, let's make a teleport function. Public void teleport to Site of Grace. Now, we're going to use an integer for an ID. Why is that? Well, if we go to the Site of Grace, we can see I'm using an int for the Site of Grace ID. So we can just use that. Very handy, very simple to do. We can put an int variable here, and we can say site ID. And this can be used in the inspector too for buttons. I'll show you what I mean in a second if you don't know what I'm trying to say. And we can say for each. And then we reference our world object manager.instance.sites of grace. So we're looking through the entirety of our sites of grace until we find one that's matched to the site ID. We can say if world object manager.instance.siteofgrace.id or .id. And I believe we got to make that public because it's private right now. Yes, it is. So let's go ahead and make that a public variable, integer Site of Grace ID. You could use a getter here if you'd rather do that. I understand it's safer, so you can't actually edit it. Up to you. So if it does equal that Site of Grace ID, then we know we have our teleport location. So we're going to teleport and then return and stop the search. So for now, I will make a comment. We can say teleport, and then I will say right below that, return. All right, cool. What's next? Well, let's go back to our Site of Grace interactable. Now let's make that function down here for teleporting. And all we're going to do is say public void teleport to Site of Grace. Now remember, you can't do this when you have a co-op partner, so that makes our life a lot easier. We can just get the local player too right now using our handy dandy network manager method. So we're going to say player equals network manager singleton.local client, and then we get the player manager. Now the player is only able to teleport when not in a co-op session or game. I'll put that comment up here. So we can just grab the player here and then teleport and not have to worry about it. Of course, you could allow the other character to teleport too. It would just be weird if you're going to do some things where you like reload the game and set the stage for quests and stuff, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So enable loading screen, that's what to do. Probably in the next video, we'll do a loading screen and load order of loading your NPCs and all that stuff when you teleport and waiting until loading is done. And then teleport the player. We're just going to say player.transform.position is equal to teleport transform.position. Save that, and we have to call this. Make sure you change the IDs on your Site of Grace. So the first one's 0, the second one is 1. Next, go to our player UI manager, and then we're going to go down to the Site of Grace the teleport location manager. And we're going to basically, we have location 0, that's going to be ID 0, and then we have location 1. So on click, add an event, drag in teleport location manager, use teleport to site of grace. Remember, it requires an int. We can set ints here in the inspector on buttons. So that one stays at 0, and this next one will be location 1. Now, if you want to do something a bit more descriptive, like using strings or enums, you can use whatever you want here. I'm just using integers because they're really simple, and at most, you're probably going to have like 25 or 30 of these in your game if it's a fair size. So it's not too confusing. All right, teleport, world object manager.instance.site-to-grace-i.teleport to site of grace and save. Now, if we jump back into the game, you can see the site of grace is already active. So I'm going to rest at it, travel, opens menu, go down to beyond the boss, boom, there I am. So obviously we're going to have the loading screen pop up first. We're going to wait a second, fade it in and fade it out, but you can see it is working. But you don't want to be able to teleport here unless it is unlocked. So let's do that real fast too. Now, I'm going to do a very super simple version of this. Like I said, if you want to make it a bit more descriptive, you can. Under Player UI Teleport Location Manager, I'm going to make a function called check for unlocked locations. I'm going to call this whenever we open the menu. So check for unlocked teleports. What we're going to do, since I'm using integers for the ID, and this is super simple, because like I said, you're probably only going to have 25 or 30 of these in a fair size game. But if you want to make them enums or strings or names, you can do that. I'm going to keep them as integers. We're going to make an array for the game objects of all the buttons we have. And I have buttons, as you can see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're going to reference the button's length in a for loop, and we're going to check for each button. We're going to compare it to the list of total sites of grace. Okay, so we're going to do that by putting a for loop within a for loop. So we're going to go down through the buttons again, and for each button, we're going to check it against every site of grace. If the site of grace's ID is equal to the button position in the array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's how I'm naming them. Button 1 is tied to site of grace ID 1. Button 0 is tied to site of grace ID 0. If these match up and the site of grace is active, then we know we have the button. If it's not active, then we know we don't have the button. So what do? In the case where we do have the button, we're simply going to enable the game object. And then in the case where we don't have the button, we're simply going to disable the game object. Now, the good thing about this is there's always going to be at least one button because you have to activate a site of grace to access this menu. Okay, so we have the button. We're going to activate the game object. Otherwise, we're going to disable the game object. So if the site of grace is active, then activate the button so we can teleport there. Otherwise, disable it. Now, we're also going to use this to get the first button that we have active and then select that as our first button in the menu. So, for example, if you have location 1 unlocked and there's 1 through 5, then your first button that you're going to select is going to be location 1. If it's 3, you're going to select 3 and move up the menu, blah, blah, blah. So call this under Open Teleport Location menu. Let's go back to our Player UI and add these teleport locations into the array. So we have location 0, you can see it matches up, and then 1 and 1. So let's keep it very simple, do that, let's save that. Now let's go back over into the location, and I'm going to remove that select button on enable because you might have a situation where you unlock the second site of grace first. We don't want that. So then it would try to select the button that's not actually available. So let's make a bool for has first selected button, default it to false, and then if a site of grace is active, remember you're always going to have 1 because you have to rest at a site of grace to access this menu. And the first location that the list finds, we're going to default to that button first. And if you want to get fancy, of course, you can store the last selected button and go back there every time you open the menu and blah, blah, blah. We've done this before, so I won't go over it again. It's a pretty straightforward process. So we're going to say has first selected button is equal to true if we find a location that is active. And then we're going to say teleport locations I. We're going to use .getComponentButton to do select. And then we're just going to select that button by default. So we have to come up here and say using UnityEngine.ui because we don't have access to the library, which lets us get the button variable. So using UnityEngine.ui getComponentButton. And then we're going to say .select. And then I'm going to do a thing where we're going to do onSelect null. I'm not sure if this is still present. Before there was a weird little UI quirk where if you didn't do this, it wouldn't actually highlight the button even though it was selected. It might be fixed by now, but I still do this every time just in case. I'm going to save that now, and we're going to go into the game and try this out. So, before I do that, I forgot. Go to Player Equipment Manager real fast. When you switch your weapon, you want to un-two-hand your current weapon. This is a thing that Elden Ring does too, I believe. So we're going to go to switch right weapon. We're going to say is two-handing weapon that value is equal to false. Do the same thing on your left-handed weapon. So down here, switch left weapon. Whenever you switch weapons, on two-hand the weapon you're two-handing if that exists. All right, save that. Now if you go into the game here and I switch my right weapon, you can see I un-two-hand the weapon in my offhand. or rather onto him, my right-handed weapon, and the weapon in my offhand comes off my back. So let's go to the Sites of Grace now, test this. Travel. You can see I've only got the start room, and now it's only showing up. Cool, I can't teleport anywhere else. Now let's go to the scene, and then I am going to grab my player. I'm going to cheat him past her because I don't want to fight him right now. I'm going to unpause, go to this Site of Grace. I'm going to activate it. Cool, now it is activated. Now if I open the rest menu, the travel menu rather, you should see, boom, there we go, 2 locations. So now there is teleporting in the project. So in the next episode, what we're going to do is add a loading screen. We're going to fade it in and out when we teleport, so you're not just seeing the players snap across the world. And we're also going to talk about how we're going to handle waiting for things like when the game is loading up. We're going to use coroutines to load stuff like objects and enemies, and we're going to basically register those as loading events. And we're going to wait for all the events to be completed before we fade the screen. And we'll add a nice little fade to the loading screen where it kind of fades out and fades in. And we can even hook up our world item database to it. So when the game is loading, just like Dark Souls, I don't think Elden Ring does this, but we can show a random item description and image on the loading screen as well. I want to give an extremely large shout out to my patrons. It is genuinely because of all of you I get to keep doing this, so thank you. You have my sincerest gratitude. Thank you all for joining me again this week. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. I will see you guys next week when we tackle the loading screen and loading operations.